The first half of tonight is kind of about church structure and organization. The chapter is titled Navigating the Church from Local to Worldwide. So I'll hit some of the high points of this. And I say it's boring just because it's not my favorite part, but it may not be boring to you guys. Okay, Bob says, yeah, it is. And, it's important to know it because we oftentimes just think the church is this one big thing that's amorphous and nobody has any control of it and nobody knows what's going on, but it actually really is very well organized. And the history of it is that the Episcopal Church in this country began in the same year that this country began, in 1789, when we had our first Constitution. The United States was when we had our first organization of the church as an Episcopal church, and the Constitution and canons of the church were enacted in that year. And they resemble quite a bit sort of the structure of government. So I'm going to flip on ahead just a little bit to page 103, where it tells you sort of some parallels about the nation, the president, the Congress, the Senate, House of Representatives, and then the states and the governors and the legislatures, sort of the parallels between the governmental structure of the United States and the governmental structure of the church. And so that's pretty interesting. The one main difference is that the presiding bishop in the church doesn't have the power that a president has over the church, the same power the president has over the country. In these days, of course, there's lots of disputes about whether that power is being used properly and all of that. And then the Congress is not as directly in control. The Congress of the United States is more directly in control of the government than are the General Convention and the House of Bishops. There's less structure in the Episcopal Church and less power at the top in the Episcopal Church than there is in the federal government. Most of the power in the church resides in the local congregations and the bishops of the 90 some odd dioceses that we have around the country. In New York, we have 5, or maybe either 5 or 6 dioceses. The New York diocese has 199 parishes. There is the head bishop, and he has 2 assistant bishops that help run this entire diocese. And the bishop that's coming to see us in January, when you guys are going to be received, has been in that position now since 2012. And probably in another year or two, there will be committees to appoint a new bishop, and that will happen probably in the next 3 or 4 years, that he will step down and a new bishop will take over, and the new bishop will then have the authority to appoint whoever he or she wants in the other roles, in the assisting bishop roles.
Is there a time period in there? He can leave, has to leave?
They have to retire by the age of 72.
Okay.
So there is that limitation. I don't know if Bishop Dietschy will fill out that full time all the way to that age or not. I'm not sure. And rectors, if there's, for example, right now I'm what's called a priest in charge in this parish. There's a difference in the priest in charge and a rector. A rector is full-time, priest in charge is not. If the church here continues to do well and grow, then at one point, I hope that I will become the rector. The role of the rector and the priest in charge is really not significantly different. There are just a few little details. And a rector of a parish is required by canon, we call them canons, which are really laws, canon law, to retire at the age of 72 from being a rector, unless the bishop gives that person special dispensation to stay longer, and sometimes that happens. Terry Ellsbury, who was over at St. Matthew's for something like 28 years, stayed a couple of years beyond the age of 72 just because, you know, I mean, he was obviously good for the parish, and the bishop let him stay a couple of years. And that's usually about as far as it goes, is a couple of years. So if you flip back to the beginning of this on page 96, it's kind of interesting. There's just like 3 pages here, called A Troubling Call, and it really talks about how, when you have a call to ministry, that it's disturbing, because you're kind of like going, okay, am I really cut out for this? And is this really what I want to do with my life and all that? So it talks a little bit about that, but I wanted to call your attention to page 97, about 2/3 of the way down. It talks about Bishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, and he was a reformer of the church, and actually spoke out very powerfully for those who were oppressed in El Salvador. The Roman Catholic Church actually didn't think he was going to be quite such an activist, and he was, and it made the Catholic Church a little bit uncomfortable with him. But he was actually shot in 1980 when he was celebrating the Eucharist. He was elevating the chalice, and he got assassinated by the rebels there in El Salvador. And then it talks about the Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He's a pretty well-known guy, and the part that I really got interested in here is that he said in a quote, "The universe will come to perfect unity and find itself one with God, the highest point of pure consciousness, always pulling the evolutionary process toward its promised destiny." So I love that quote, because to me it says that that's what the church is for, is to pull us with it to whatever our destiny is, to perfect the kingdom here on earth, however we define that. And that's where the kind of the mystery of the church is for me, is what is our destiny? What is that perfect point at which we finally accomplish God's purposes on earth, and how do we reach that? So I like this 3 pages here called The Troubling Call. And then if you look at on page 98, the last paragraph, the most powerful meanings are often those we don't recognize until we look back, reflecting on a completely different context on the occasions of the calls. Then, having waited for the unfolding of meaning, we may experience God opening to us new life and new possibility. So I like to look at the structure of the church and how the church governs itself as trying to figure out the answer to that question, okay? If we just exist as a governmental unit and govern ourselves and have all these rules, then it's pretty meaningless unless we're doing something more. And so I like to look at the purpose of the structure of the church as accomplishing this goal, so that we may experience God opening to us new life and new possibility. So the church, as it was originally designed in the United States, and we inherited our theology, of course, from Great Britain and the Anglican Church, and before that, the Catholic Church. But if we are not pursuing that purpose, then we need to figure out a different way for church to be. So chapter 5, beginning on page 99, is all about what we are called to do as a church and how we structure ourselves as a church in order to perfect that call. And down at the bottom of page 99, you'll see that the word Catholic is used, and that is a lowercase c there, and that means universal. That's the word Catholic is Greek for universal. And that's what we say in the Nicene Creed every Sunday, one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. It doesn't mean the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. It means the universal church as a whole, that we are called to perfect our mission. And if you flip over to page 100, the word apostolic, one holy Catholic apostolic church, means that the original teaching of the church comes from the apostles and was handed down through the centuries after Jesus. And if you look in Acts 2:42, it talks about that the apostles were teaching and having fellowship together in the breaking of bread and in the prayers. So when we come together for church every Sunday, we break bread together in the Eucharist, and we pray together, and that helps us fulfill our purpose and discover our purpose, and we are called out and sent out into the world to, I hate to use the word convert because it has a negative connotation, but we're sent out into the world to teach others about who we are, about what the church is, and what God has called us to do. And then on page 101, it talks about how everyone has a ministry. People often think about the ministers in the church are, in the Catholic Church, the Pope, and in our church, the bishop and the priest and the deacons, but it's also the lay people. And every lay person is also a minister of the church and has a role in the church. And part of our function as a church is to help people discover what their gifts are for ministry. Excuse me. Everyone has a different gift. Sometimes gifts are things that take a long time to be discovered. It took me a long time to discover mine, and a lot of times people discover that they have gifts for the ministry that they haven't ever really performed or utilized. And so the church is present in our lives to help us figure out who we are as people and who we are and who we can be as ministers of the church. There are about 1.8 million members in the Episcopal Church, and 6,500 Episcopal churches and organizations as churches around the country. It says on page 102, and this was kind of a startling statistic. I didn't realize this until I read this here. Down about the middle of the page, it says, while just over half of U.S. citizens are members of a Protestant church, only 1% are members of the Episcopal Church. I had always just thought it was more than that, but I guess this has proved me wrong. It says the largest denominations in the United States are the Southern Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. And also that more than half of the Episcopal churches have under 200 members. So, for example, in the city, we have several big Episcopal churches with, 300, 400, 500 members, but most of the Episcopal churches have under 200 members. And in our parish rolls say that we have 199 members. Most of them don't show up, so I don't know who they are. And I'm being a little bit facetious about it. We have to report every year on our parochial report how many members we have, and those people that have called themselves members in the past and have been members for several years and who haven't formally left the church, even though they don't come very often, are still listed on the rolls unless they've asked for a transfer to another church. I haven't checked on your family yet. I don't know whether they're still listed or not, John. I don't know. But maybe one day I should figure that out. Any questions to there? It's all a little bit tedious, but I wanted to kind of give you guys that background before we went on any further. Okay. So as you all probably know, that Jesus didn't call himself a Christian. He just called himself Christ, I guess, and he was Christ, but he wasn't called a Christian. He was Jewish. And the Christian church, didn't really form until beginning around 90 AD or so, when the Jewish temple and the Jewish synagogues were what they called putting out the followers of Christ and didn't want the followers of Christ to be part of the Jewish church anymore, so they began to form other small congregations and worship in their own way, and that was really the beginning of the church as we know it. In the Episcopal Church, for example, our bylaws in our church say that we have, of course, every year we have an annual meeting, and that all members of the church are entitled to participate in the annual meeting and vote. And it defines a member as someone who has worshiped regularly and participated in communion for a year or more. That's what it says that we recognize as the members of the church. But I would say more loosely, a lot of people are members of the church that haven't even been formally, received like you guys are going to be, and like you guys are going to be. But they call themselves members, and it's okay that they call themselves members. You don't have to be formally received. It's just a nice thing, and it's a nice ceremony to be formally received as a person in the church. But you don't have to have that happen in order to call yourself a member of the worshiping body in the Episcopal Church. So the main governing body, you probably know this, of every local parish in the Episcopal Church is a vestry. Vestries are elected at the annual meeting. We have 9 vestry members in our parish. Each one is elected to serve a 3-year term, and every year 3 of them rotate off and 3 new ones come on. And they make decisions about the finances, the buildings and grounds, major things about investments and how to operate the church and all that. They're not very much considered to be a spiritual body as is, but they are expected to operate in a spiritual manner, so that, the really best way for a vestry to operate is the way I think ours operates, and that is with congeniality and respect for each other. But I've seen some vestries that don't operate that way, and they're constantly bickering with each other, and church politics can be difficult sometimes. That we are lucky in the fact that all of our vestry members respect each other and respect the process and respect opinions of other members of the vestry. So we actually do function, I think, don't you, John? Pretty congenially.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Let's jump on over to page 107, near the bottom, the last paragraph. Usually, and this is true in most of the dioceses in our country, there's one central place called the cathedral, where it is the center of the operation of the diocese, where the bishop usually has his or her home, and there's always a actual church that operates there. In our cathedral, St. John the Divine in the city, there's actually a church that functions there every Sunday. They have worship services, and that is what's called the seat of all the bishops. Now, on most Sundays, our 3 bishops are not actually there. They're actually out in other places. Like I was mentioning, our bishop is going to be here on January 12th, and he goes to visit about 30 to 35 different Sundays every year. He's in a different parish, as are the other 2 assisting bishops. So they have 199 parishes to cover, and they get around, each one of them gets around to the parishes about once every 5 years. And so we don't get them here very often, but that's how they sort of cover the diocese. And when the bishop comes here, for all you guys who are going to be received, he'll meet with all of us together personally. He's not going to give you a test or anything. He's just going to greet you and welcome you. The bishop normally, when he or she comes, will look over the parochial records to be sure that we're all up to date, and so I'm busy getting those things all up to date before he gets here, so that they can see that we're governing ourselves properly. He'll probably look at our budget and and look at our pledges and see what's going on in those areas. So they really do have an oversight function, but they have staff that helps with all that, and the bishop's canon, Gene Person, is gonna come here to see me on January 2nd to sort of prepare the way for the bishop to come. Kind of like John did for Jesus, you know, prepare the way. So that's what'll be happening. So if you'll turn over to page 110 and 111, you will see the different provinces of the Episcopal Church. We're in Province 2, which consists of New York and New Jersey. There are two dioceses in New Jersey, the Newark and the New Jersey diocese. And then in ours, 6, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 6 different dioceses: Western New York, Rochester, Central New York, Albany, New York, and Long Island. Each diocese has representatives that attend the General Convention of the entire Episcopal Church of the United States every 3 years. And that convention is when any changes can happen to the Constitution and the canons of the Episcopal Church. Representatives consist of bishops and priests and deacons and lay people to General Convention every 3 years. And then each year, every diocese has their own convention. We had ours in November. I went, and our senior warden, Duane, went. And that is where rules and regulations are passed and changed, and propositions are voted upon and things like that. So that's how this church governs itself all over, and that's pretty uniform throughout the United States, okay? On page 112, the presiding bishop right now is Michael Curry. I've mentioned him to you guys before. He is the first African-American presiding bishop that we have had in the church since the beginning. His predecessor was Catherine Jefferts Shorey. She was the first woman bishop that we've had as the presiding bishop in the United States. The important thing about this section of the book, I think, is on page 113, about halfway down. It says the priorities of the budget and of the function of the Episcopal Church are guided by the 5 marks of mission. And these are kind of like the church's baptismal covenant. And if you'll notice there, it says to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, to baptize and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to seek to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and to pursue peace and reconciliation, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. So as an example, in the General Convention that happened this year, there were provisions that were in the Constitution and the canons of the church that were changed. And there's always, disputes, differences of opinion about what the church ought to stand for and what the church ought to do in certain areas. And for the first time in the Episcopal Church, it is now the rule that every Episcopal church, every Episcopal parish has to offer to anyone who wants it same-sex marriage. Now, every priest doesn't have to perform them. A priest can say, no, I'm not going to perform those. And if that's the case, then that parish will allow someone else from another parish to come in and perform a union with the same-sex couple, so that there's no discrimination against same-sex couples, but no individual priest is forced to do something he or she doesn't want to do. So it's kind of a nice accommodation, and there are different parishes. I know priests in places that would say, no, I don't want to do that, and so they can't forbid someone to be married in the church. They have to have somebody else come in and perform that ceremony. And there's been lots of those kinds of things through time, the controversy that existed back in the 70s and 80s over whether women could be priests. It was one of those, kind of things. The Book of Common Prayer, which is the main source of our liturgics and our worship service, is the one that we use now. It's the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. They're currently undergoing a study of how that might be revised, modernized, or updated in certain ways while still preserving the main theological points. The last change in the Book of Common Prayer was undertaken beginning in 1950, and it took 29 years to get that one in effect. So I don't think there's a big danger in this one being changed real quickly, but it will eventually be changed because the study of it and the changes and the arguing over it and then discussing it and, going through all the theological points and questions takes a number of years. So the previous one was 1927, then we got a new one in 1979, okay? One important point, it's set out here on page 115, is that the Anglican Communion is the entirety of all the Anglicans all over the world. And we are only one member of the Anglican Communion, which is a group of 44 independently governed churches of 85 million Christians in more than 165 countries, okay? And every one of the different provinces in the Anglican Communion has what's known as a primate. A primate is the head bishop. Our bishop is, as I said, Michael Curry, and all the other provinces have their own primates that they are governed by. The commonalities that exist between all the members of the Anglican Communion are those that are at the bottom of page 115, that the Old and New Testaments are the revealed Word of God, and the Nicene Creed is our statement of Christian faith and belief. We have the sacraments of baptism and Holy Eucharist, and that bishops follow a succession of ordination from apostles to the present. Whenever a new bishop is consecrated anywhere in the Episcopal Church, it is done by 3 other bishops. So there's 3 other bishops that lay hands on a new bishop in order to make that bishop a bishop. So that's uniform throughout our church, okay? I think it's every 10 years, on page 116, every 10 years, there's a thing called the Lambeth Conference that happens at Canterbury in England, where all of the primates from all over the world of the Anglican Communion get together, as well as most of the bishops from all over the world to come, where they discuss church doctrine and church governance, and sometimes there's divisions in what happens there. Our current assistant bishop, Mary Glasspool, is a gay woman, and she has a wife, and they are not allowing her wife to come to the Lambeth Conference this year. I don't know why that is, but they're not. So it's kind of a big deal to Bishop Dietschy and all that's happening. So the part that I starred that I think I want to put the most heavy emphasis on is on page 117. And this is sort of, to me, the crescendo of this chapter, because all these rules and all these structures and everything that's put in place has a purpose. And that purpose is, if you look down right in the middle of the paragraph, it says, "We are invited to become part of God's dream. We are the active hands of Christ in the world who can work with God to bring God's kingdom near. We are charged to do the work of the church. And the structure of the church is a mechanism to do that good work." So all the things I've been telling you about, and all the details, and all the structures, and all the governance, and the Constitution and the canons are all for that purpose. And I I take the position that sometimes all those rules and structures are contraindicated to this essential purpose. Sometimes they don't serve that purpose because we get too tied up in the rules and the constitutions and the canons, and we don't really see the big picture of this paragraph that I just quoted to you. So as you guys are here and as you become involved in the structure and organization and function of the church, always have that purpose in mind and ask yourself, are we serving that purpose? Or what are the things that we do every day and the structures and the rules, do they really serve this purpose? Because if they don't, they're not worth a whole lot to me. So I'm preaching at you a little bit, but that's sort of one of the problems that a lot of people have seen in the past, even way back in the Reformation time, was that the Roman Catholic Church didn't always function in this way. And so that's why they started Protestant churches. Well, we don't want to do the same thing, we don't want to make the same mistake. So if we're not following that purpose, then all the formalities really don't serve that purpose as they should, okay? All right, so I'm going to stop there for just a minute, and then in a minute we'll go on to sort of what I think is the most important chapter, and that is our ministry, our participation in the mission of God. But you guys have any questions about what we've gone over so far, or comments?
The rules of the church.
Uh-huh.
You said you can have changes. Is that the head bishop making suggestions for changes, or is it the bishops below, or can it be the?
Yeah, any delegate to the General Convention that happens every 3 years can propose a change in the Constitution or the canons. The Constitution is kind of like, we have a Constitution and then we have laws under it, right? And that's the same thing in the church. The Constitution of the church, the Episcopal Church of the United States, and then there are canons, which are the laws below it. There can be changes to the Constitution or canons, and there's a procedure for proposing those. They have to go before, commission to do them, get them worded properly and all that. And then they have to be, they have to give notice to everyone that's coming to the convention so that they can all read them in advance and look at them. And then when you get to the convention, one of the things that happens at convention, and it's a week-long convention, is to vote on them and decide whether they're going to pass them or not pass them. So anybody at any level can begin the process of proposing a change to the Constitution and or the canons of the Episcopal Church. Same thing is true in diocesan conventions. We had a diocesan convention about 2 months ago, or less than 2 months ago here in the Diocese of New York. And there were a number of different changes to certain parts of the Constitution and canons of this diocese. So each diocese has their own. When there's a conflict, then the prevalent one is the national church, and so most of them are in accordance with the national church. But any individual in the church can, through the governance, can propose changes to the various laws and canons of the church. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else have questions? All right, so I want to focus your attention on page 121. The very last paragraph, right in the middle of that page, that I think is the most important message of the whole book, and that is, don't let others tell you what is real. Imagine God's reality, see things differently, magnify the Lord, see God large in your life, allow God within you to transform you and the world through you. That, to me, is the purpose of our mission. That's if we aren't doing that, we're not being church. So long as we are doing that, then we are, I think, participating in the mission that God calls us to do. We all have our own view of what parts of that are important and how we go about doing it. But if that's what we keep our eye on, then we will usually come out, doing pretty well. If we don't do that, then we're gonna make mistakes. So if you turn to page 124, at the very top there, this is the pledge. It's part of our baptismal covenant. And this is the pledge that the bishop will ask all you guys who are gonna be confirmed or received on January 12th. These are the questions the bishop will ask you, all right? And this is what you guys will respond when he asks that. Now, you guys will all have a program, so you will have it right in front of you what you're supposed to say, so you won't be tripped up.
Yeah.
But this is every new Episcopalian says these words when they are received or confirmed in the Episcopal Church, and the bishop asks these questions, and you guys then give those answers, okay? So, on page 125, sharing God's mission. It says the Episcopal Church recognizes all baptized people as ministers of God's kingdom. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 4 levels: lay people, bishops, priests, and deacons. So what we do as ministers in the Episcopal Church is we try to use our gifts in the most effective way, in the most loving way that we can find to use them. Now, oftentimes, too much emphasis is put on gifts being used in the church, or at least I believe that too much emphasis is sometimes placed on that, as opposed to putting emphasis on using those gifts out in the world, okay? You can use gifts as a minister of the church in a school. You can use gifts as a minister of a church in a grocery store. There's so many different ways that one can use one's gifts as ministers of the church. Anytime that you're demonstrating God's face to another human being, you're acting as a minister of the church, or at least you have the capacity to be acting as a minister of the church. So I want to encourage you guys to think about it in those terms rather than this is what we do as church members. Think in terms of this is what we do as ministers of the worldwide church, as ministers of Christ's love of the world, that we demonstrate that everywhere we go, not just in the church and not just to church people. We do it in so many different ways, okay? Even here in the very last paragraph, it says we carry out most of God's mission in our daily lives by greeting people kindly, doing our jobs with love and respect for others, lending a hand when needing, cooking for family, laughing and consoling friends and coworkers. So our ministries are very broadly defined, and our gifts are very broadly defined, and we all have multiple ones. And sometimes we have some that we don't even know that we're using from time to time. So that's really an important part of what I think this book says. Down on page 126 at the bottom, this is something that's really kind of important to me, and I have a very good friend that I met in seminary who is the oldest person ever ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church. He was 74 when he was first ordained a priest, and he was one of my classmates, and we just love each other. He's a wonderful guy named Walt. And Walt and I always had an argument about what God's kingdom was. And he said, well, God's kingdom is here. I said, yeah, God's kingdom is here. I get that. I understand that. But not everybody recognizes that. And I said, there's so many people in the world that can't feel that, and that's, our job. And he said, I don't care, God's kingdom is still. So we always there was kind of a semantic difficulty about what God's kingdom was. And, I talk about God's kingdom when I preach, especially in Advent, because that's one of the most important terms about Advent. But here's what I think is important about that concept. It says the world falls short of what God would like. Although we may see signs of God's kingdom, it isn't here completely. So to know what our ministry is, we need to understand what that kingdom looks like and figure out what we can do to help make it happen. Okay, so if we take one statement about what God's kingdom is and what our mission is as lay people or ordained people, is to help shape that kingdom and to help bring it about. And the good part about it is that we don't need to think that we can bring it all about ourselves. Where all we are is little seeds, that sprout. And if we look at ourselves as seeds that sprout, then we can say, we start the ball rolling and somebody else completes the picture as we go through time. And good part about it is we don't know what the end is, right? So we don't have to look at the end and say that's what we're trying to bring about. We just need to make it better each step of the way as we do it. And that begins, if you turn on page 127, that begins from the very start, from God's dream in the Jewish scriptures. And so one of the most beautiful passages of scripture is quoted here on page 127 and 128, and it's near the very end of Isaiah chapter 65. And this is to give you just a little bit of the history of the Hebrew scripture, particularly Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet from way back in about 700 BC or so. And Isaiah preached and taught that the world the world of God, or the kingdom of God as it was being formed at that time, was already corrupted by human influence, and that the Jewish people weren't fulfilling what God wanted them to fulfill. And so they had elected kings that were corrupt, and they did things like that. So he prophesied against them, that because of that, somehow God was going to strike them down, punish them, whatever. And it ended up coming true because the Babylonians came and captured them all a couple of hundred years later, right? And then the Babylonians came and captured them all and took them away to Babylon. The story continues. The whole book of Isaiah is 66 chapters. Only the first 39 were written by the real Isaiah, okay, of the 700s or so. The second part of Isaiah, scholars just call it Second Isaiah, chapters 39 to 55, was written after they were taken to Babylon. So in other words, what Isaiah prophesied was going to happen did happen. They were taken to Babylon. The last 11 chapters were written by a third guy. It's called Third Isaiah. It was written after they came back from Babylon and were freed and were able to return to their homeland. So that's what this scripture here is quoting from, is from Third Isaiah. And it's talking about now how they've come back to their homeland, they've been freed again, and how beautiful and wonderful it is that they've learned from what Isaiah told them was going to happen to them, and now they've come back and they were freed. So that's why this is so beautiful. I mean, they shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity. They shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and the descendants as well. I mean, it's a really beautiful poetic language, but if you know the history behind it, that's how the Jewish people felt when they got to come back home. Now, this doesn't tell you the rest of the story. They messed it up again, like we always do. And so somebody else came along later and told them they were going to get punished for messing it up again, and they did. But it's very, very beautiful poetic language. But that is sort of how I love the way Isaiah does this, because it's talking about the difficulties that we have from our own human failings and how we don't do what God's will is and how we stumble and fall when we don't. So that's sort of the recurring story, right? It's a recurring story of the Hebrew people, and it's our recurring story, that we continue to mess it up, right? And so we have to figure out how to get it right, and once we figure out how to get it right, maybe we will bring about God's kingdom. That's sort of the whole mission. So if you look at, beginning on page 129, 129 and 130 talks about sort of the hallmarks of God's kingdom, being justice, joy, abundance, and community. And when you really boil down the scriptures, that's what the Gospels are all about, right? They're talking about justice, they're talking about joy, living in a joyful state, and a life of abundance, not meaning necessarily material abundance, but an abundance of love and in community with one another. So this is in essence boiling down to what our ministry is enabling everyone's ability to live in harmony with each other in that way. So we too, down at the bottom of page 130, it says we too are called to proclaim God's dream. And part of proclaiming God's dream is discerning what God's dream is, and that's what the scriptures help enable us to do. Now, one of the things that's really, really big, that became really, really big in Paul's writings. So just to give you historical background a little bit, Christ was born, lived on the earth about 33 years, formed his communities, and he was crucified, resurrected, and ascended to heaven. There was these little bands of people on the way, on Jesus' way, that were still around. Out of those communities formed little pockets of Christianity around the Mediterranean, and the most important one of the people who formed those little pockets of Christianity was Paul. Paul was a Jewish man, and he used to persecute Christians in his travels, and he was stricken down one day and saw the light, and then learned about Christ, and was converted and was taught by a guy named Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas and Luke went around the Mediterranean starting these churches. One of the things that Paul talked about most often, and what he's most known for, is his talk about gifts of the Spirit. So if you look down at the bottom of page 131, it talks about the gifts of the Spirit, and there are a variety of gifts, and that everyone has spiritual gifts. And if you read through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you'll see a lot of Paul talking about the gifts of the Spirit. And he lists a number of them. And one of the things that he emphasizes is that not everyone has all of them. You know, all of us have a few of them. Some of us have one or two, some of us have three or four. And part of our lives are discovering what those gifts are and then putting them to use to do what we've always been called upon to do, which is to spread the kingdom to other people who don't yet know it. And that's what Paul talks about so much. There's a little chart on page 133 that you guys can look at home if you want to, and it's sort of a self-evaluation, whether or not you're using your gifts in the way that God's calling you to use your gifts, and asking you to look back over your lives and answer the questions about whether you have and whether you can, and how you can do so in the future. And if you read on pages 134, 135, and over into 136, it really goes into quite a bit of detail about this discernment process of understanding what your gifts are, finding out how to use them better, and to use them to their fullest extent, and considering your own life and how you have or have not used the gifts as you've gone through life, and how you can better prepare yourself to be able to use them. So when you get a chance, I think that's a really, really important part of what what we're all called to do is to figure those things out. One of the most important things in this chapter is on page 138. And I really fully believe this. Down right over at the beginning of the top of page 138, it's always important to discern our spiritual gifts with a group or someone else. We do this for many reasons. Discernment is difficult. Our friends, mentors, and family members can give us guidance and perspective. Because we're human, we can be led astray by our own egos and lose sight of God's call to us. So having a community around you to talk with, to pray with, and to be with is a way to understand what your gifts are. I don't think I ever would have become a priest had I not had a loving relationship with people in common, that I had in my church at Grace Church when I was going on mission trips and stuff, and the ability to determine what it was that I was called to do, and we do that in community. You don't just sit down and think, oh, I'm going to do this, because you may be really messing up. Because if you're not really equipped for it, and somebody's not there to tell you you're not equipped for it, then. And I've had people tell me I'm not equipped for things at times. So I just say, okay, go the opposite direction. So that's why church is important to ministry. We minister as a church, and we minister from a church because our community supports us in doing that. And if you take a really, really close look at the post-communion prayers that we have on Sunday at the Eucharist, it says that we go out to do the things God has given us to do, but we go out from the community. We don't just go out on our own by ourselves. And if you look down here on page 139, it actually quotes from that, "Send us now into the world in peace, and grant strength and courage to love and serve you." So the community is an important part of who we are, and it's an important part of discovering who we are and putting our gifts to the best and most appropriate uses. So that's the flyover, and I talked pretty fast because I wanted to kind of get it all in. So do you guys have questions or observations about that, or even life experiences that you could lend to this discussion? Because as I've told you so many times, we're all different, and we all have our own stories, and our own stories shape who we are, and they shape how we relate to other people around us. So if you guys have something that you want to say, or you want to point out about your own journeys or anything, it's a good time to do it. I don't want to keep you, beyond 8 o'clock or a little after, but I don't want to keep you guys from saying what you have to say. Experience.
One thing that I've noted is in the Catholic Church, which is what I was raised in, I was always drawn to the Franciscan priests and the Jesuits, as well as the Marian Order of Sisters. And the theme there from them relates to what we just had in this chapter about that mission of going out, being there to help people. And it was just nice to see that carry through, because there's some things in the Catholic Church that weren't as comforting, I'll say. But this was a nice theme, and it carried right over here, so I enjoyed that.
Yeah, well, good.
I thought that was very similar, I thought.
Yeah, that's nice. If you've ever been to a convent and seen them work and seen them pray and see them be in community, it's a beautiful thing to watch. It really is. And I go to Holy Cross Monastery once a year for 3 or 4 days just to hang out and see the monks at work. And they're really cool guys. I mean, they're not what you envision as a monk, just kind of, walking around with sour face all the time. They have a good time, and they're fun, and they support one another. And one of the guys up there is a young guy that I've gotten to know pretty well, Brother Aiden. He was ordained at the same time I was. And I first met him going up there and doing a gardening retreat. and digging in the flower beds and just having a fun time, you know?
They have a
And
good
they,
house.
yeah, that's the, and, you know, they function in the same way as the monasteries in the Catholic Church. And that's how, that was really the beginning. The monasteries in the 4th and 5th centuries were the beginning of churches. People didn't have really churches before that time. And so that was the beginning of churches and sort of a structured prayer life. Most of the time before that, they worshipped in homes. So it was really the beginning of something, and it stood the test of time, you know? It's really neat. Have any of you guys ever been up to Holy Cross and seen it? It's up on the other side of the Hudson River, up a little bit above Poughkeepsie on the other side, about 10, up near West Point, yeah. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful old building. And it's just fun to go in, and they have these little tiny rooms, you know, that you sleep in, and they're very austere. You know, it's just a bed and a blanket and a pillow and one lamp, you know, and that's all there is in there. And they have quiet time. They have 7 services a day, and after the last service is over with, in the evening, no one says a word after it's like 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. And the next morning, you get up and you go to breakfast. Nobody says a word until after breakfast, until you go to the first service in the morning when you do the chants and the psalms and all that. So it's really a time to sort of be at peace and kind of, you know, get into your own little world and your own little thoughts and all that kind of stuff. And it's very relaxing. You know, you can go there for 3 days and just come back different, you know, feeling different than you did when you left. So they have really cool programs. I mean, they have all the time. They have little retreats going on where you can go up and spend 2 or 3 days listening to someone talk and having a workshop and all that kind of stuff. And I've done it 4 or 5 times, and I always come back, you know, kind of refreshed. And it's beautiful. It overlooks the Hudson River. So if you ever get a chance, it's just cool. I mean, the little monk guys are walking around in their robes, you know, and their sandals and stuff. So it's just kind of fun. Any other questions you guys have about anything or thoughts that have come up? Okay. Well, I hope this wasn't, this didn't seem to be as interesting a material as what we covered the first 2 times, because it was more just facts and organization and stuff like that. But if we think of it as the organization has a function, and if we're constantly checking and questioning whether the organization is performing that function, that's what we need to be thinking about. Because if it's not, you know, we're not doing any better than Christians 1,500 years ago did when they messed it up, you know? Mm-hmm. So we have to always be asking ourselves if we're doing those things that our baptismal covenant calls upon us to do, and if the church is organized and functioning in a way to facilitate that. And if it is, you know, we're doing okay, but we have to be mindful of the fact that we can really mess it up and get off on the wrong track sometimes. Okay? All right, well, thanks a lot for coming. And
I would just throw out, if anybody gets a chance, St. John the Divine, they have a winter solstice. I think it's the 21st of December. Is that?
Yeah.
I've been a couple of times. It's spectacular.
Mm-hmm.
It's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Where is that?
In New York City,
Okay.
St. John.